Hello, I'm Theron Pummer. I'm a philosopher here at the University of St. Andrews and director of the Center for Ethics, Philosophy and Public Affairs, or CEPPA. And today I'm speaking with Professor Hilary Greaves. She's a professor of philosophy at the University of Oxford, and also Hilary is director of the Global Priorities Institute at Oxford. Her current research focuses on issues to do with global prioritization and consequentialism, aggregation, population ethics, moral uncertainty, the interface of ethics and economics, and formal epistemology. Hilary and I have also just co-edited a volume called Effective Altruism: Philosophical Issues, and that's forthcoming with OUP. Today, I'll be speaking with Hilary about the topic of longtermism, in particular the case for longtermism. So I'd like to welcome Hilary and kick things off just by asking her, just what is longtermism?
Longtermism, roughly speaking, is the view that the very best actions we can take, after taking into account our uncertainties even, the very best actions we can take are best because of their effects on the course of the very long run future of humanity and other sentient life, rather than, as we might more normally think, because of their effects on the immediate future, say today or next week or even the next 10, maybe even the next 100 years. Long-termists think you have to look at what the implications are beyond 100 years even, in order to work out which are the best actions.
Okay, great. So what is then the case for long-termism?
In the context of resource prioritization, long-term has potentially very wide-ranging practical implications. There are many discussions, for example, within the effective altruist community, in government, in intergovernmental organisations, and in the context of exercises like the Copenhagen Consensus, where people are asking this question, okay, I've got a fixed pot of resources, I'm in principle completely cause neutral, that is to say, I'm open to considering any intervention in the world as a means of using these resources. It's not, say, a pot that's already committed to global development or it's already committed to the arts. It could be used for anything. And I just want to know, as an empirical matter of fact, in which cause area would I be best advised to spend my resources, insofar as my aim is doing the most good, improving the world by the most that I can, given that resource constraint. And at the moment, many people think the answer to that is, for example, global health and poverty interventions. And there's a clear reason why you think that might be the case. In a world with massive global inequality, given that a given amount of money improves people's well-being by a lot more when they're poor, than it does when somebody's already rich. There's a clear case for transferring resources from the affluent Western world to the global poor. But long-termist lines of thought suggest that something else might be better still. There are a number of candidates for potentially very high-value long-termist interventions. I should say the case for thinking they are very high-value is not completely clear-cut, or perhaps I think one of them actually is quite clear-cut, and then a lot of others are much less clear-cut. The most clear-cut one, I think, is reducing risks of premature human extinction, largely because of the development of advanced technology over the last 50 years or so. We're living in quite an unusual time at the moment, historically speaking. Until around 1950, there were not significant anthropogenic sources of extinction risk. But worryingly, that's definitely not the case anymore. There are several new technologies, including, perhaps the most familiar example of this is nuclear weapons, but others that have recently come on the scene is the possibility of forthcoming development of artificial general superintelligence, which could be extremely detrimental for humanity, to say the very least, if it doesn't have values built into it effectively that are aligned with human values. Another example would be synthetic biology. It's becoming increasingly possible to manufacture extremely virulent strains of viruses. If those, for example, got into the hands of terrorists, then an extinction-level global pandemic is far from out of the question. So there are now all these threats that we didn't historically have to think about, and the areas are currently very under-resourced. So there are lots of things we could be doing to mitigate those threats that we're not currently doing. And then if you think about how long humanity could potentially survive for, if we don't go prematurely extinct from one of these kinds of threats, and you add up all the value that would be contained in all of those lives, in the case where we don't go extinct, that's an enormous number. So even if we can do anything that reduces the probability of premature human extinction by a tiny amount, in expected value terms, that is when you average across your uncertainty, the contribution of that kind of intervention could be massive, much greater even than the best things we can do in the area of global poverty.
Could you perhaps say a bit more about what you mean by expected value?
Expected value theory is the standard approach to the question of rational action in the face of uncertainty. So a standard example might be, suppose you're going for a walk, but it's Scotland, it might rain. You don't know whether it's going to rain or not. You do attach a certain probability to the possibility it might rain. So you think it's 40% likely it's going to rain today. And then you also have in your head numbers about how good or bad the various possible outcomes are of, firstly, your decision to go out for a walk with an umbrella, and secondly, your decision to go out for a walk without an umbrella. So the possibilities here are, I go for a walk in the sun, but I'm encumbered by having to carry this umbrella around all the time. That's a bit negative compared to just being able to go out free-handed. And then, obviously, in the case where it rains, you think it's much better to have the umbrella. So you can attach numbers to precisely how good or bad you think these various possible outcomes are. And then expected value theory gives you a way of collecting all those numbers together and doing something with them to get advice about whether in the end you should decide to take the umbrella or not. Basically what it says is, okay, you've got these value numbers, the numbers that represent how good or bad the various possible outcomes are for each action. You've got the probability that it's going to be rain versus not rain. So for each of the possible outcomes taken separately, you should first calculate the so-called expected value of that outcome. That is to say, you should take a probability-weighted average of the possible values that might result from that action. Then you do the same thing for the other action, and expected value theory says that you should take whichever one has the highest expected value. So it's a way of taking into account consequences, even once we've admitted that we don't know what the consequence will be, but we do attach probabilities to the various possible consequences.
Some people might think, following the logic of your argument, that we should be sort of fanatical about the far future and prioritize even really tiny chances of doing really large amounts of good in the far future over practically anything else, including well-evidenced interventions in extreme poverty. Are you at all worried about this?
It's definitely a good thing to think about. Some people have worried that because expected value theory in some circumstances, namely when you have an opportunity to do something that has a tiny probability of generating an extraordinarily large improvement, expected value theory, if the amount by which you could improve the world is large enough relative to the smallness of the probability, expected value theory will sometimes say, yes, in expectation, that is, according to the expected value approach, that's the best thing you can do, much better than this thing that you could do that would generate a merely large benefit with certainty. Okay, so in some cases that seems counterintuitive, and some people take that to be an objection to expected value theory. They think, okay, this just shows that even if expected value theory performs well in most situations, it can't be, in completely general terms, the right way to deal with uncertainty. We should find some other non-fanatical decision theory. I think that's a very natural thought to have, but here, as often with decision theory and moral philosophy, the devil turns out to be in the details. Various people have tried to formulate a non-fanatical decision theory, and it seems extraordinarily difficult to do so. The most obvious attempts to do so, at any rate, turn out to have other undesirable features that I think it's clear are much worse than vulnerability to fanaticism. So this might just be something that's true about rational decision making under conditions of uncertainty, and then we should follow through the implications of its being true. I think the other thing to say about fanaticism is, well, why are we worried by this suggestion that maybe we should shift resource allocation towards the long term? I think to a significant extent, if that's where the arguments point, it's just not an objection. Maybe that just is the thing we should do. The point at which I think it starts getting worrying is if we reach the conclusion that we should basically be doing nothing for today's needy. We should be doing this really callous thing of saying, I'm sorry, your children are going to have to keep starving and dying of diarrhea because we've got this other opportunity to improve the course of the very long run future, even though you're standing there right in front of me and I could help you. There seems to be something strongly morally amiss with that. Here I think it's just helpful to separate the question of what would be the best thing we could do, with the emphasis here on best. What would be the thing we could do that improves the state of the world as a whole by the most possible amount, from the question of what morally ought we to do. Consequentialists think that those two questions are just the same, basically. We ought always to do the thing that would improve the world by the largest possible amount. But consequentialism is extremely counterintuitive. So insofar as there's something counterintuitive going on here, I think it's just the counterintuitiveness of consequentialism. And you could accept long-termism as a thesis about what would be best, but then supplement that long-termist thesis with some constraints that say, look, maybe you can shift resources significantly in the direction of improving the far future, but you can't completely ignore today's poor. You have to at least save some reasonable sized resource pot for helping them out. And I think if we take that kind of approach, then the counterintuitiveness of the long-termist conclusion is significantly mitigated, and we could probably live with the consequences if that's where the argument leads. One thing that's often suggested in discussions of this issue is, well, maybe we should just ignore probabilities that fall below some very, very, very small threshold. So if there's some action you can take, and here are the results that you think will most probably happen, but there's a 1 in 10 quintillion chance that this astronomically valuable thing would happen if you took this action. Well, 1 in 10 quintillion is such an astronomically small number, we should just completely ignore that. So regardless of how much value it would generate, even if it was 20 quintillion units of value, just don't include that stuff in the calculation. So maybe call this the ignore very small probabilities decision theory. Intuitively, it's a natural response to the fanaticism worry, and on the face of it, it looks like it will get rid of fanaticism. But on reflection, it's clear that this is actually not even a well-defined decision theory. And the reason for that is that whether something is an astronomically small probability depends on how you describe it. Whereas what our decision theory says we ought to do had better not depend on how we choose to describe things. So, for example, consider a case where you conduct a lottery, say, with 1 million tickets. Maybe 1 in a million is small enough that we get to ignore it, according to the ignore small probabilities decision theory. But there are various things you might want to talk about in the context of this lottery going on that you don't want to ignore, right? So the lottery is going on in the next room. You and I are having this conversation in this room. You offer me a glass of water. I'm thinking about whether or not I ought to accept this glass of water. I think of the various possible consequences of this. Maybe it won't taste very nice because they chlorinate the water too much and around here and so forth. But if I choose to describe the situation in such a way that the possible outcomes are I drink a nasty tasting glass of water and lottery ticket number 563,679 wins the lottery, well then all the possible outcomes of drinking the glass of water have astronomically small probability, so I should just ignore all of them. But of course if I ignore all probabilities for all possible actions, then I don't have a decision theory anymore. In principle, there's scope for a lot of different academic disciplines and a lot of different sub-disciplines to contribute a lot to this discussion of whether long-termism is true, if so precisely which version of it is true, and what are the implications if it is true. I think at the moment, given the early stage of the debate, philosophy and economics are particularly relevant, and then within those, the most relevant sub-disciplines are moral philosophy and decision theory in the case of philosophy, and probably microeconomic theory, as opposed to more empirically facing work in the case of economics. Other disciplines that are plausibly highly relevant in the longer term as the discussion develops would include law, politics, sociology, psychology, and also history, because this attempt to influence the course of the very long run future clearly depends on a lot of empirical stuff, and we can learn a lot from the experience of history about which things tend to work versus not, which things have worked historically, or which things, in the light of our understanding of how history actually went, do we think would have been likely to work historically if people had tried them at the time. So the Global Priorities Institute is a new research institute we set up in Oxford, started about a year ago. At the moment it consists mostly of philosophers and economists, and its mission is to take on precisely the kind of questions we've been discussing today in recognition of the fact that while there are plausible reasons for thinking that something like long-termism might be true, firstly at the moment it's very unclear actually whether it is true, because of these concerns about whether it's just too intractable to influence the very long-run future. And secondly, what exactly are its implications for how we should be allocating resources if it is true. So what we've been doing so far is putting a lot of time into formulating a research agenda, which you can find on the website of the Global Priorities Institute, where we set out systematically over the course of about 30 pages what we think are the highest priority research questions in the first instance for getting started on this project.
Hilary Greaves, thanks very much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, it's been great to be here.
And thanks very much for watching us.